if there's a clear set line, right? I'll go back to my Garden of Eden thing. There, we were given, there was a clear and there was a set line. Don't eat of this tree, right? Nice, beautiful, picture perfect. We don't have anything clear cut like that anymore.
So we need to look with a critical eye, a really critical eye, and use all of our senses, our philosophical and theological and scientific minds, to determine, what are the guiding ethical principles, and are we doing this because it's convenient? Are we doing this because of some sort of misguided sense of perfection? Or are we doing this out of a sense of genuine self-offering love?
Do we play God when we don't provide health care for somebody?
Modern medicine is changing rapidly. Now, we can alter your DNA. Or we can just make another you. Doctors are having to answer some pretty tough questions. But it seems like no one's asking the biggest one. Just because we can do something, should we? Who's answering these questions? Where does God stand in all of this? Or have we just kicked him out altogether? Are we just playing God? Bioethics is a relatively young field. Kickstarted in the 1960s after an explosion of medical advancements, and with them, ethical quandaries. Basically, a bunch of clergy sat down and started talking about what if what they were doing was right. But over time, the number of clergy has gone down. Where did they all go? And who's having these conversations now? What does that mean for bioethics?
The question is there such a thing as ethics that's not religious? Not whether or not religious ethics should be injected into it. Because if there were, then the question would be, should there be some ethical paradigm that is somehow divorced from religious precepts? I'm not sure that that's possible.
That's their parish members are involved in every aspect of life. I mean, they get ill, they get treatment, they come to places where medical technology has run its course and where a choice may need to be made about whether to live or whether to die, or whether to be allowed to die, and what fashion that takes place in our culture. So not to be involved in that would be a major abdication of moral responsibility, I think.
Kind of the perpetuating of the separation between church or faith and science as well. That is by far the most hurtful thing to think about, that there are either scientists or clergy, right? Because it could definitely be on both sides of things, that both sides are like, no, there's no room for this person. And I think that hurts us more than anything. We don't have those clear-cut lines. And so I think that's whenever it starts to come, you have this intersection of spirituality, religion, faith with your ethics, right? This is something that you have to be consciously thinking through as you're doing these things. You're your own line.
The way in which we manage and engage death is really horrible as a culture. We are routinely seeing people who are suffering unnecessarily. Because our medical technology, a great blessing, has advanced to such a degree that we can keep people alive in states of being that, in the first millennia of our existence, it wasn't in question. And I've been with families as they're dealing with a brain dead relative and having to deal with the decision of whether or not to remove the tubes or not to remove the tubes, and you get these difficult questions of what is life and how do we make that decision. And frankly, if our medical system wasn't so proficient at keeping people alive, families and patients themselves would be spared lots of suffering.
in saying that it's left to God, I don't mean that it's a passive decision, right? It's not this sort of sitting back and being like, God is going to do what God is going to do. I think that God calls us to be active and calls us to make decisions, right? There are times in which I think God can be abundantly clear and reveal a pathway to us. But at the same time, I think God also calls us to make a decision. And God is going to be at work in and through that decision, whatever that decision might be. So I see both cases and situations as God is in control and God is in charge. And God is the one who is determining life and death. And God is active in and through the choices that we make.
It's problematic when we begin to define life in terms that are too concrete. It suggests that that's something that's ours to define. So taking God out of the picture entirely is a major mistake.
Once you begin to allow someone to say, I can help you die, then that becomes more acceptable in a society. And so to do that makes it seriously questionable from a moral standpoint, if you believe that life is the gift of God.
But passive euthanasia is something that's different, whereas someone is dying and is being given the comforts as their life is coming to an end. So like a hospice care sort of thing. That is completely permissible. But a physician-assisted suicide, that's where the denomination
Designer babies are babies whose genetic makeup has been selected to eradicate a certain defect or ensure a particular gene is present. This is all part of the Human Genome Project that seeks to uncover everything about DNA. It was originally started to try and target genetic diseases. But now we can target almost any gene, controlling things like gender, or even cosmetic changes like height. Have we taken things too far?
I think leaving it strictly to God and being hands-off is unrealistic. But I think, I feel like I shouldn't even have to go into how designer babies could be complicated. I mean, the role of this has been tried once before in history, with tragic results.
I don't have anything really against in vitro fertilization. It's once there is this sort of, once you really start becoming super nitpicky with the DNA and everything, that's whenever you start to get changes that start to happen. And that's where you start to take away almost the science of everything, right? And how like someone is biologically being formed. Now you're starting to really tamper with that, something that has worked for hundreds of thousands of years.
The impulse towards perfection, human created perfection, is perhaps one of the more dangerous idols that we have.
And it's just grown up in my lifetime since my college days. We just knew a little bit about genes and biology, but now designer genes are coming on the scene. There's a big difference, however, I think, in spending enormous amounts of money on designing babies that look this way or that way, and designing babies that are healthy and are relieved of a future genetic illness, a genetically caused illness.
It would seem that there would be some sort of guiding principle for bioengineering that would differentiate between those things that enabled and gave life and those things which truncated, shortened, or eliminated life. Oh gosh, I think most of us try and play God most of the time. So sure, I think doctors are playing God, but I wouldn't say any more than I do. I mean, I think that's what we're so terrified that God doesn't exist that we try and become God because we're horrified of the alternative.
We get these catchphrases, and we play God all the time in one sense or another. The economic choices we make are playing God on certain segments of our population.
Where I think we struggle with limitations and with the idea of being limited. What does it mean to say that we were created to be limited, to not have access to absolutely everything? I think that that's where you can start to get into dangers and struggles whenever it starts to come to science, is the belief that science will help us to bust down all human limitations, that we should not be limited. That's where my issue would come in. But to use our minds to help people, to help it so that those who maybe are limited, can't have a child, to find ways that they can have a child, I think is beautiful and wonderful. I never want to speak out against that. But it's the thought that we are meant to be like God. We are meant to be God. That's where I start to have issues. And
so yes, I would say doctors are playing God, just like the rest of us. But that doesn't mean that God's not at work and all that.